And we're live.
Thank you. So welcome everyone to this workshop on development contributions. We had one last week where we had quite a bit of detail in really understanding the nuts and bolts of development contributions. The decision before us at the Finance and Performance Committee this week is primarily based on the actual charges, not so much on the broader policy settings, which will occur later on. And you'll know in your pack that there's a question time at the end of the presentation to sort of discuss that in a bit more detail. There are two presentations and we talked to officers. Some of it's a recap from last week, but we just thought it was useful for you to at least have that as part of your notes, and officers will briefly go through them. I'm not sure when there's, I think we'll just play it by ear in terms of questions. I will take questions on sort of a clarification point on any of the slides that we go through as the time we're going through, so everybody's aware. But if you've got any sort of major significant questions, we'll leave them to the end of each of those presentations. So who's up first? Is it?
I am.
Okay.
Yep. Morning, councillors. Thank you for being here. Look, we had a workshop last week on development contributions, so thank you for attending that. That was a high-level overview of the DC's framework, if you like. The second workshop is just a recap, do a bit of a recap on that, but then also to dive a little bit more into a bit more detail around our policy and some of the changes that are being made. You know, it's at one level, the development contributions policy is, you know, what's in front of you is quite simple. Simply, we're updating the policy to reflect the budget that's been approved through the 2021 long-term plan, right? And as part of that review, we've also made a couple of changes to the template to make it fit the DIA framework, and also some changes to the map. So at one level, it is quite simple. But at another level, it's quite a complex policy. There's lots of different moving parts, and I guess that's why we've got two different workshops on it. So to help you understand it all and get comfortable with the information, so you can make decisions on Thursday, we have got two quick presentations. We've got Gina Sweetman, who we've been working with for the last month or so. She's an expert in this space. She's been operating in the planning space for the better part of about 28 years, and she's an expert in DCs, and she advises not only us, but also lots of other councils in New Zealand in that space as well. We'll then hear from Leila and Marty in terms of our policy, and we'll also talk through some of the changes in terms of the charges and an example in terms of what that looks like as well. We're not going to go line by line. We want to get through it reasonably quickly and leave plenty of time for you all to you know, ask questions and for us to be able to answer them as well. So at this point, I'll ask for Gina Sweetman to come online and to do her presentation.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Your Worship and councillors. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction, Baz. As Baz introduced me, Gina Sweetman, I'm a Development Contributions Commissioner appointed by the government to hear objections to development contributions, but a lot of my work is also in the space of, as Baz said, working with councils to review and update their policies. Currently working with Far North District Council as one example to create a new policy in the first instance. I'm also one of your RMA commissioners who hears resource consents from time to time on your behalf. What I've got for you this morning is just a brief presentation which is covering really the fundamental principles around development contributions. There are some particular nuances in the legislation that it's important that your development contributions policy meets. And that's really what I've been working with your council staff on, is ensuring that the updated policy is fit for purpose and it puts Wellington City Council in a safe space in terms of the policy. So I'll just start on the presentation. Bear with me with this technology. It's always entertaining doing this remotely. Now, can you all see that okay? I'll take that as a yes.
Sorry, Gina, no, we can't see that.
You can't see it? Okay. What is that not doing? Is that better?
Yep.
Okay. Right. So the key thing about any development contributions policy is it needs to show what we call the causal nexus, which is really the relationship and the linkages between the level of development that's expected in the city, what infrastructure is required in terms of both upgrades to existing infrastructure and new infrastructure, and who pays for it and how much do they need to pay. Quite simply, to require a development contribution, there just really has to be the fundamentals of there is development occurring, there is growth occurring as a result of that, and there is a need for expenditure by the council to meet the needs of that development. So the fundamental principles that are enshrined in the Act around development contributions include that basically any development must create or have created a requirement for assets to be provided. Now, the Act calls these community facilities, so which I know Leila went through last time. So that covers your network infrastructure of your 3 waters and transport, your reserves, and what we call community infrastructure as well. So while one single new household, for example, might not trigger the need for an upgrade, certainly the cumulative effect of a number of different developments occurring can trigger that need and the need for upgrades. We have to make sure that when we're putting together policies that we're avoiding any overcharging. And Leila's got a really good example of that in respect of Moa Point, for example, where works have happened in the past to upgrade. We know exactly how much that cost. We know exactly how many household equivalents that it will accommodate, and we ensure that in the policy it's clear when the charging will stop. And we're also being quite clear that we're ensuring that the costs are spread across over an appropriate time period as well. One thing that your team has also been carefully considering is the cost allocations and ensuring there is a fair proportionality about who will benefit from the assets, including the community as a whole, and who will pay. So obviously, if there's an upgrade of existing infrastructure, which is required by growth, in many instances, there'll be also some benefits that will accrue to the wider existing community. So we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to make sure that we're recognising that in setting the development contribution charges. So just on that note, again, we're needing to be incredibly clear about what costs are for just maintaining levels of service for our existing community. What are the costs from renewals, and infrastructure and other assets that just need upgrading and renewal, and what are the costs for growth, and making sure that we apply those proportionally, to the different projects. And so that's what's happened in terms of the projects in your long-term plan. We can't use the old slush funds that may have been in place in the past. So we have to be very clear when we're taking development contributions that they are being used for the purpose that they were collected for and where they were required as well. So making sure there's good accounting systems in place, a development contribution that's taken for Roseneath for a particular purpose is going to be spent in Roseneath, for example. So in our policy, in that vein, we also need to be quite clear about what the development contributions are being used for and why, what are the projects that are being needed, what is the growth occurring, why is it needed, and also ensuring that when we are implementing our development contributions policy, that someone who is a developer out there should be able to look at the DC policy and very easily figure out how much is payable and why, what the methodology is, and where in the policy to look for the different projects as well. There is the ability to group projects for practical or efficiency reasons, and that certainly has been the case that the council's taken in terms of your policy. You have some citywide contributions for things like the Botanic Gardens, where obviously the community as a whole in Wellington City benefit from the use of the gardens. And then grouping other things to just the area about where they are located. We generally try to discourage the use of district-wide groupings because of that, just being able to demonstrate that causal nexus about showing that growth is using a particular asset, is creating demand. But certainly it's not banned outright and you can use it, and we have used it in your policy. Another thing we have to be very careful about when we're creating the policy is making sure that we're not what we call double dipping or double charging, and being quite clear about where revenue is being accrued from. So basically, if NZTA Waka Kotahi is funding for particular works for a particular project that has a growth component, we need to make sure that we recognise that funding from Waka Kotahi, and we're not double dipping and trying to get more than is necessary. This slide, which is probably a little bit hard to read, just really shows you the process that we go through, though, in terms of developing a development contributions policy and going through an upgrade. So it's really having a good understanding of the growth that your city is experiencing, and certainly Wellington City has done a whole heap in this space, as you know, over the last few years. It's having a really good understanding of your assets and exactly what their state is, what capacity they have, and what projects are needed in terms of improving. And that sits obviously all alongside your 30-year infrastructure strategy as well. Once we've got that wider picture, then we have a look at the financial management side of things in terms of where is revenue and funding coming from, what level of reliance should there be on development contributions for what. And once we've got all of that picture together, then we can develop the development contributions policy, or update it as we have in this case. The last two are just showing that it's, we develop the policy, obviously, then it has to be implemented, and obviously it's very important to make sure it's up to date and fit for purpose. And lastly, just in terms of the base information that's needed in terms of any policy, obviously you need to know the growth projections, you need to know your current state of your assets, of your community facilities, you need to know what's funded in your current long-term plan, what's forecast in your infrastructure strategy, and what are your funding sources. So that's a very much a high-level, quick run through of the fundamentals for a development contributions policy.
Thank you, Gina. Now, is there any sort of, I know before officers go into their presentation, is there any general questions or comments? Councillor Foon?
Kia ora, Gina, thank you. Can you give me an example of the development contributions in terms of the district-wide, and I guess using something like a project like the library versus a local park? Like how would they fall into the categories you've described?
Certainly the Central Library could fall into that category of a district-wide grouping, given that it is used by the city as a whole compared to a local reserve for instance. So certainly that could be classified as being community infrastructure. Obviously, the care and caution needs to come into apportioning what's growth related in terms of upgrades that may be necessary with that. And then what is just providing your usual service to your existing ratepayers as well.
Thank you. Mayor Foster.
Look, thanks, Gina. My question is sort of a little bit similar to Laurie's, but thinking about it about things that are part of a network. So, for example, our reserves network, so say our green belts, or potentially you could have a sports field network or whatever. If we say, look, we want to put something which is in a particular part of the city, let's in the suburbs, but because it's part of an overall network, you know, we've got the entire green belt as opposed to a partial green belt. What's your thinking about the degree to which something like that would be local and would be district-wide?
It's having thank you, your worship, it's having a good understanding about who are the users of it. Is it something that is used citywide, or is it a locally used facility? That's the important thing. Then it's also, again, that proportionality thing about how much, if you are doing upgrades, if you're providing new facilities, how much of that is for growth related compared to just existing community related as well.
Yeah, I get that.
That's the hard bit. So, you know, in terms of the green networks, you know, I live in Northland, just at the bottom of Te Haumaorangi, and certainly that's well used by the wider Wellington community. So potentially you just have to have a good argument, and it needs to be clear and rational.
And so it will inevitably be a degree of subjectivity about the balance between local and district and some of these things, but provided it's within the bounds of reasonableness, we're okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
And I think, Gina, you made a comment at the start, something like the Botanic Gardens.
Absolutely. So it's not just city users, is it? It's the wider region who use the Botanic Gardens by all means. But certainly you can, for the city citywide contributions, absolutely justified to use development, you know, citywide development contribution for that, because the wider city uses it.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any further questions, so maybe Baz and Leila, we can proceed to your presentation.
Thank you.
Sorry, I got. Okay, g'day. Can everyone see that? I got the screen share up before the unmute. Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to speak to us again. Yeah, and we'll just try and go quickly through, and we'll be talking more about the actual charges and where they are in the city. So last time we presented, we gave you all the aspects of the policy without going into what the actual charges were, and that's where we'll get to today. There's the background you're already familiar with. We've got this alignment with the long-term plan expenditure coming up, and we're just going through a bit of a recap and discussing the new charges. Now, Gina's already covered this, but just the terminology there, where it's all considered community facilities in the language. I got tripped up over that word. I thought of facilities as being a bit more mundane than all the infrastructure. So it's the water, wastewater, stormwater networks, transport reserves, and the community infrastructure. Just as a point of interest, community infrastructure was something that we collected development contributions on when the policy was first approved in 2005. The ability to collect those was taken out of the Local Government Act, I think in 2014, and reintroduced in 2019. So at this review, we're bringing the community infrastructure charges back in. The other key, when we get going, because we're diving into the detail of the policy now, the other key feature is that equivalent housing unit. And that's the measure of that we charge development charges on. That's like a house, a segment of office space, like it's like 42 meters spread of office space. There's also discounts for smaller houses, and the equivalent housing unit is based around assumptions about household size. And then we've got this balance and proportionality between what's a citywide charge and what's a localized charge. And when we talk about localized charges, we talk about catchments, and we have catchments for reserves. And they're usually, the reserves are charged citywide usually because they're harder to break down. People might use the town belt from a number of different access points, but there are 2 zones, one in the north for reserves and one in the inner city centre for reserves that show up. There's 5 different transport catchments, and those are, again, it's where you can apportion quite a localised use for transport. Somewhere like Adelaide Road was apportioned between local use and citywide. And for example, with the hospital being near Adelaide Road, a big proportion of Adelaide Road serves the whole of the city, but then it also serves the local community. So that one gets split up. Now we've got a couple of slides coming up that talk about the overall funding. Should I go past those or should we come back to them? We'll do them quickly now. I'll hand over to Marty and then we're going to dive into the charges. So we're coming up to the big picture funding. Do you want to talk to my screen or yours?
Yeah, Morena, councillors. Just want to check that you can actually hear me. Maybe Chair Calvert, do you?
Yes, I can. We can hear you and we can see you now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, twice. That's unfortunate. So I just wanted to recap from last week's workshop. I realised we went into some details and just wanted to go back to the high level. And councillors, you'll recall that we have to operate a balanced budget, both in the operating space and the capital space, and that's what the funding impact statements show, our expenditure and where we get the revenue from to balance that budget. So just, you know, in the operating space, you've got your total expenditure there on the left. You've got your income sources from user charges and fees and NZTA revenue and other income, and then the balance is made up through the rate system. In the capital space, which we don't often talk about, you've got a very similar picture in terms of balancing the budget. You have 3 types of capital expenditure. One's renewals, so you're replacing your infrastructure assets. That's initially funded through debt, and then that debt is repaid through rate funding the depreciation. You also have level of service upgrades, which is funded by effectively perpetual debt. So that increases our debt level. And then you have level of service upgrades for growth, and that's the growth in the population and workforce. And that's also initially funded by new debt and then repaid through development contributions. And that's the purpose of this policy, is to set those contributions to recover that expenditure that was spent on new infrastructure for that population. So an example of this is, since this policy was introduced in 2005, we have spent about $160 million on new infrastructure for growth. But where the revenue, because the revenue comes in only when the developments occur, the costs occur obviously as you go through that infrastructure construction. The revenue has come through so far at about 53 million. So we're still just over 100 million short in recovering to date the amount that we've spent on infrastructure. And what the charges will do, and as we'll see soon, is the charges are going up, and that's because we've actually added in more infrastructure because we've been through a new LTP since the last policy was set in 2015. And so just the last of my slides on the next one is just to show the magnitude of that spend. I'll just look at the previous slide. So the total cost of relevant capital works that's not replacing our infrastructure assets, so it's not renewals, it's upgrades for level of service and growth, is 2.8 billion. And of that amount, and that's the policy since 2005 to the end of the LTP planning period, Of that, 298 million is for growth. So that's the amount that we've got to recover through the DC policy. Otherwise, if we don't recover it, then it ends up in a higher debt balance than we've forecast. And so the DCs cover approximately 11% of our capital works program, a portion of CapEx. Our budgeted revenue, which is a very difficult thing to budget because simply we don't exactly know how much development is going to occur within a year, is around 3.5 million per annum. And as I said previously, we've so far recovered about 53 million through development contributions. I'll hand back to Leila to take us through the rest.
Just before you do that, I just wonder, Marty, I'm still, and maybe it's just me, but just trying to understand this slide. I'm trying to add it up in a spreadsheet in my mind, and I'm not sure whether that's the right approach. But you're saying basically over the next 10 years we've got 2.8 billion worth of capital expenditure projects. Is that right?
No, I'm saying that since this policy was introduced in 2005. Yep. And since then, we've got 2.8 billion worth of capital works that's not renewing and replacing current infrastructure. It's upgrades. And some of it's upgrades for levels of service and some of it's upgrades for growth. And the growth part of that is 298 million. So all that's doing is giving you a feel that we're a significant amount of our extra capital expenditure is for level of service improvements, not for growth, and that's why the projected debt levels are significantly increasing over the course of the LTP. The 298 million for growth is due to be recovered through development contributions.
Okay, all right, thank you. And the rest is from rates?
No, so that just going back to the CapEx slide, the previous CapEx slide, those are the three sources of funding for capital expenditure. The rates funds the depreciation, which repays the capital costs of renewing assets. The other two are funded by debt and development contributions on some of that.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks. I just wanted to be clear on that.
Okay.
Diane, can I just ask a question on that one?
Yeah, sure. I can't see people's hands up, so.
Oh, I can't. Yeah, okay, sorry. I'll put the hand up in there.
Okay.
Can you, Marty or Leila, can you just get my understanding right? This you said there are the 298 million. You said that was since 2005, which was growth related. Marty, in the previous slide, you said 160 million, of which we recovered 53. So first thing is, can you just clarify what the actual amount of prospectively of growth related capex that we've spent since 2005 is? The second bit you said is that we got 53 million in revenue so far. So does that mean we've either A, undercharged, or B, that we are still charging on new development, which will help pay for whether it's 298 or 160?
Yeah, good questions, and sorry for the confusion. So just going back to the capex graph there. So the 160 million is the amount that we've spent so far since 2005 to date. The 298 million includes the amount that we're capturing for growth. That includes the 160 plus the additional capex we're going to spend on growth in the LTP. So we can collect for that and start collecting for that now in advance of that actually happening.
So that's in the LTP 2021 to 31. Well, actually, it's not 2021 to 31, but it's 2021 effectively to 51, isn't it, in several areas?
Yes, but we're only collecting for 20 years.
20?
First 20 years, yeah.
First 20, well, 20 is better than 10.
Yes,
okay.
And so the 160 forms part of that 298. The 53 million that we've collected to date is really just displaying the mismatch between the revenue timing and the expenditure timing. So obviously, generally we build the infrastructure up front, and then that's available for developments to occur. So you have to have the water pipes and the sewage pipes and the roads in place prior to the development. When the developments occur, that's when we get we get paid the development contributions, which refund the borrowings that you've used to create that infrastructure. And so
Right.
the difference between the 160 and the 53 is that timing difference.
So we are now going to be charging, according to this, and obviously there'll be discussion about whether the 298 is the right number or not the right number, but we are now going to be charging at the moment DCs on the basis of the 298, of which some infrastructure is already in place and some is yet to come.
That's right.
Absolutely.
So it's not a matter of under recovering or undercharging. It's just a matter of timing.
Cool. Thank you.
All right.
Sorry, Jane, I had a
Councillor
follow-up. Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
So if we go flip back to the next slide where you were saying we're budgeting for $3.5 million a year. So now I'm just trying to make the math. I'm following up your question, Councillor Calvert, trying to make the math that up. If we are collecting $3.5 million a year, it's going to take us a lot longer than 20 years to get up to the number that we're looking for. So again, I'm wondering about like, what are we spreading?
Yeah.
Years are we spreading this across, and how does that work? Because it's
$3.5 million is the current budget. So it has been it started off much lower with a lower lag. Early on was only 1 million, and it should be ramping up with more and more development. But again, it's just a forecast on the timing of that revenue from when developments occur, and the quantum of those developments in any given year.
So, as we go through the charges, I'll go through the charges, and it'll go through a few examples of how we collect the DCs over time. So perhaps we can look at those and come back to that question as well, because it's certainly something that took me, it took a bit of getting because the development contributions, some of them, and I guess this is a case in point like Moa Point, for example, is a case of good planning. It was built for an additional capacity, I think, of another 44,000 households at the time it was built. It's been collecting development contributions since the start of the policy, I think, at 1,185 per development in the area served by Moa Point. And there's the two other plants, and those are smaller areas. And it will continue to collect development contributions up until it's collected for 44,000 new developments. And what that does is it spreads the costs over the whole period that growth is taking place. So I'll hit a couple more examples and then hopefully it'll be clearer. Was that a little bit helpful? And is that okay if I continue on into a bit more detail there?
Yeah, and we may need a little bit of a spreadsheet following on from this presentation just to show some things out, I think.
Yeah, and there's
yeah.
And also there's a spreadsheet at the back of the policy that does have a list of all the projects. So it's listed in a few different ways. Yeah. But just so diving back, so we're going back from the helicopter onto the path, and we're determining an actual development charge. So you get your growth, your projects, the cost allocation, and there's this where you're making reasonable assumptions about what is the growth amount. So for example, if you're expecting a population to grow by 6%, you're making the library bigger, that's your growth amount. And then you've got your number of units. So for example, on the Moa Point case, there was a cost divided by 44,000 additional units expected, and that becomes the charge per EHU, which is that measurement unit. And then for each EHU, there's going to be a sum of lots of different little charges. So this just states it in words for the word people. So you've got your growth expenditure for community facilities project. You divide that by the number of units of growth, the EHU that are going to be served by it. You work that out project by project. So we have that at the back of the policy. It's Schedule 2. And then you sum them up to get your DC per EHU, and those are collected as each development is constructed. So I've made up an example because a made up example gives you nice round numbers, and it also takes you away from trying to think about the infrastructure However, I live in Strathmore Park, so I always think of a local park. So if you think of any local park and say it needs to be replaced, you've got to pull out the old equipment, put in new equipment, and it's going to cost $120,000. Now, that would be a nice figure to actually get a playground for, but there we go. So part of that is renewal. The old equipment was rusty, it has to come out. Part of that is level of service. So let's say there's new health and safety regulations. You can no longer have tarmac underneath the swings. You need a bouncy surface. And there might have been a little bit of growth in the area already that you hadn't anticipated. So now you're building for all the families within walking distance of this playground. And then you go to your planning documents, your population planning, and you realize that there's another 300 households expected in walking distance of the playground. And that is going to be your growth. And that's the component, that's your growth cost. What you do is you take that extra 20,000 that's determined as for growth. So there's 300 expected households. And as those are built, they will each collect $67 in development contribution. So although we've got what turns into quite a big policy and quite complex, this is the basic building block that sits underneath it all. Here's one from a citywide charge in Wellington. And I hope I don't go into, I realize I have picked an example that I'm not totally across, but say there's new sports fields coming in, 14 million, growth component around 3 million. And the citywide growth number that we work with when we're looking long into the future is around 30,000 household units. We divide that and we get 110. So that will be part of a citywide charge. Now you say, look at something like a synthetic sports field. You think, oh, that might wear out before the 30 years are up. That wear and tear, that will be funded through renewal or level of service. So, but it's actually creating the asset that the charges accrue on. And now I'm just diving into the different charges and the changes of what we've got coming up. So in our spreadsheets and in our little projects that sum up, the Parks and Reserves charge is moving to $644, and then you can read down that column. Those are the new charges. You see there the community infrastructure. So the projects nested in there is that would have the library work, the aquatic facilities, the citywide community infrastructure also includes things like cemeteries. So those are the new charges, and that's why you've got that not applicable in the current ones. So you see the total citywide charges, this is the first time you're seeing the new charges, unless you've read the papers, are going up by $1,389. And that is most of the increase and the only increase in large proportions of the city. You can see that breakdown and the difference there. Now, I don't present these figures as a proportion because we're not increasing figures as a proportion. The proportions come as what proportion of a project is for growth. It's not a relationship like that. This is a summing up of projects rather than an across the board proportional increase. So the citywide charge applies in all the 20 different map areas that are different catchments. Then there's additional increases. Churton Stebbing goes up, and that's related to roading, transport, and new reserves up there. Granada, Lincolnshire. Now those are our outliers where the fees are already over 10,000 and they're going up, and they are more the greenfields type of developments. Newlands has got some additional charges for water, and then central and coastal, that's big parts of Miramar, Lyall Bay, the central suburbs, Te Aro. That's going to be served by the new water reservoir. Inner city, Pipitea also picks up some of that water reserve cost charge. When you go into the policy, if somebody's diving in, they want to see, and this is what Gina was speaking to, is people just need to be able to go and see what the charge is, what it's based on. You get table 1 in the policy. Rosenheath is map A, so it comes right up to the top, but it's a nice example because you can see there's no new roads going in Rosenheath. There's no specific new transport charge. There's citywide total residential charge, and then there's water supply, wastewater, and transport, parks and reserves. Now, you'll notice there the non-residential is a lower charge. Non-residential do not pay the citywide reserves figure, and they don't pay the citywide community infrastructure. Skipping down. So this is the absolute heart and soul of the changes. We've got a current range from 3,261 to 10,900. The new range, and so the minimal increase will be that citywide one plus, it's now going from 4,647 up to 17. Now that 17,001, that is a bit of an outlier. When we talk about them in general, most development, the areas where most developments concentrated through the central areas through intensification, those are all coming in around, they'll all still be around the $8,000 mark. We had a quick look at Pororua and Hutt City. I've got a clarify. Is that a clarification? I can see a hand up. Is that a clarification? I'll carry on.
It's a question for when you're finished then.
Oh, okay. So we've looked at Pororua, Hutt City. So there are quite a lot of different ways of framing your DC policies. So direct comparison isn't always great, but that's the other ones in the area. And yeah, so those are the charges. In the documents you have, the key parts, if you really want to look at the breakdowns and what are the projects, you go to Schedule 2 of the policy and Table 1. And also in the Statement of Proposal, we've tried really hard to make it read alone and just give a clear picture of what are the proposed new charges, what were the charges, and explanation of the differences. Might be revisiting that, we could put in a little bit more detail into the Statement of Proposal. Now that we've been analysing the figures for things like this workshop and working out how can we explain it more clearly. Aside from that, we can move on to questions in a minute. So the next review will be at the next LTP, or if there are earlier amendments. Three Waters reform could bring in changes. It could, the DC policy could come up if we're looking across the board at what council charges, but otherwise we're just looking for questions today. Yeah, ready for the meeting.
Okay, thank you, Leila. I see I've got Councillor Day.
Thank you.
Councillor Day.
Thank you. You've explained that so well. I feel like I really have a much better understanding of that now, so thank you. My question is, so you've calculated these costs off the district plan proposal, have you? Because obviously if you have more intensive development, some of those development contributions would go down, wouldn't they? I mean, some will always be the same because you just have more infrastructure needed, but some costs would go down if we had more intensive development. Would that be right?
I'm trying to think if you can answer Marty.
Yeah, I can answer
Passing
that.
to Marty to answer.
So obviously there are some work streams that are slightly out of sync with the last LTP, and I guess the spatial plan and the district plan review were one of those. So any capital costs that aren't built into the last LTP aren't included in the charges. But you're absolutely right. Where there's surplus capacity, either already built or about to be built or currently being built, and the development's going to occur faster because of, say an increased building height limit or more intensification, then that will recover that cost more quickly.
Oh, but so I guess I'm thinking, if we're wanting to make sure that people build as many homes as they can, then potentially having slightly lower DCs, as long as you're making sure you're getting your community infrastructure that you need as part of what we need to be able to do, isn't it?
Yes, it won't change the DC amount because the amount's calculated per equivalent household unit, which is the unit of demand on that infrastructure. So if you have more houses,
there'll be more demand.
You would create more demand, and therefore we've got to build even more infrastructure.
Yeah, although you can imagine with high-rise buildings, some of the infrastructure wouldn't necessarily change. You just need it to be slightly bigger, or yeah.
There may need to be, so once the district plan has been all the way through, it could feed back into amended number of units that you would expect in an area. And that's something that we've definitely got to keep in view for review or updating. It would create quite marginal changes, but it might change the divisor for some projects. So say we expected 1,000 new houses somewhere and it's going to be 1,200, then you might be dividing that by a different number. But balancing that out, there might be more infrastructure
Required.
identified for growth. So there's a lot of, and that's, I guess that's where some of the complexity and moving parts comes in, especially because you can't do everything at once and you can only work with what is agreed. So there's been so that is in view and may need to be reviewed under future reviews.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Foon.
Thanks, Leila. That's been so helpful. My question is just clarifying that those costs in slide 13, they are per each housing, the equivalent housing unit?
Yeah, they are. But there are a few exceptions and different ways of managing things operationally. So for a very small, so the underlying assumption of an EHU is around 2.6 or 2.5 people. I think the calculation varies over the 20-year time period. Some detail goes on. But if someone's building a smaller dwelling, then it's 0.7 of an EHU. Because it's about the capacity of the building, and things like so retirement villages and visitor accommodation, obviously they don't get charged a full EHU. There's also provisions in the policy for special assessments, and those usually apply more to the larger construction projects or large buildings, or somebody's building 200 houses. So yes, those are the charges. And then in the detail of the policy, there's some exceptions in different processes.
So then the question then is, as you just beautifully outlined, a smaller size dwelling, what about a larger size dwelling? Does the EHU is that taken into account?
Yeah. No, I might, I'll just say one comment and then I'll just check if there's a colleague who might be able to add more. Our policy doesn't, I think it was the word granular, we don't have that sophistication in our policy. So there isn't something for a larger house at this stage. And there are different ways of measuring the EHU. So at this stage, we've updated for the charges and the new template, and there's updates to the maps. And we thought about, we looked at, do we need different measures for different kinds of commercial properties? We worked out it wasn't a priority at this point. And the matter of bigger houses was raised by some people, and it's not somewhere we've gone in this review. And Marty, can I speak to that as well?
Yes. So the simple answer is no, it's not taken into account. We do average the number of occupants in a house and use the average. We have, as Lois just pointed out, where you've only got a one-bedroom unit or dwelling, then we drop that down to 70% of the charge of the EHU. So it is averaged. Part of that is necessity through administration, so very complex set of calculations. And as you can imagine, you've got hundreds of projects that you then have to carve the growth proportion out of. And then you've got to do that over, now since 2005 right through to 2031, 2041. You're dealing with a lot of data and a lot of complexity already. So it is averaged. It's not about the current use of those dwellings either. It's about the potential future use. And that's probably more important when it comes into commercial space. And so the simple answer is yes, it is averaged. And we will look at it through the next review to see whether it warrants splitting some larger dwellings out.
Now that's really interesting. So when is the next review? Oh, sorry.
So the next review, the second half of this review is happening over the next year. which is going into more of the finer details once these charges are updated, and the core policy settings and the change of this template into a more usable format have been done, which is this review. The second half of it will be looking at some of those finer details.
Okay, thank you. I'll just sit on that for a minute.
Okay, thank you. I've just got a couple of questions. Just we had Gina talk about how we had to have a good accounting system to make sure that contributions were being used as collected. So are we comfortable that we have an adequate accounting system?
Yes. So in short, the invoicing occurs in a system called Teamwork, and then there's a feed of the data of all of those charges that comes through to the Tech One, the main financial accounting system, and there we track it from there.
Okay, thank you. And the government's Housing Acceleration Fund, if that's kicked in, does that mean that in any sort of major developments, presumably, where does that fit in? Does that have any impact on development contributions being collected for growth?
I'm not familiar with all of the nuances of that fund, but suffice it to say that the principle is that we can't double dip. So if there is other funding that's funding infrastructure for growth, we can't collect development contributions for it. And so we exclude any other revenue sources that's funding growth infrastructure.
So our policy will enable that now?
It currently does, and will continue to. Yep.
Okay. All right, that's fine. And you briefly touched on the second part of the review. So this is, just to clarify, this is just about the charging regime, and then over the next 12 months, you will be looking at. You talked about the second part of the review, and are you and is that when you can look at different sizing of properties? And
I can speak to this a little bit. So, so in updating the charges, so some of the things we looked at that we raised, which I think that come up is like the size of the property or different kinds of commercial property. We worked out there was a lot of analysis needed, and it would feed any changes like that would actually fundamentally feed right through the policy and need fundamental change. So we thought, well, we need to get it into the new template, and we need the new charges up. The new template should feed off and make it easier. It's just a cleaner, more modern document for updating anything. And that would enable us to take a second look at some of those things. And for example, the one on the size of a house. So Auckland have a completely different basis for their DCs based on, I think they use square metre measures around the house. Now, because our development contributions goes it almost timetables, it goes back in time to 2005 and it goes forward. If we made a change like that, it would actually fundamentally have to go through and look at everything. And so we parked some ideas and we said, oh, those are things to keep looking at. And then anytime it comes up for review, so there's a new charge, we can revisit some of those things. And that's when we say second review, there's a few things that there's a basket of things that can always be looked at, but they're actually not straightforward because they involve fundamental change and through the entire models. Does any of my colleagues want to add to that? And have I captured that about right, Marty? Yeah.
Okay. So I don't have the statement of proposal in front of me, so I just so it may already be in there. But are you planning on asking as part of the consultation, asking for any future ideas or views from submitters in terms of what could potentially feed into the second part of the review?
We haven't actually developed the statement of proposal questions yet, and that's been it's been a point of interest because it's a Section 282 consultation, and because there's not a lot of policy change as such, that's quite a good idea. We could frame questions, what would you expect to see in future, or do you think there should be a higher charge for a bigger building. So we could test out some
Yeah.
questions like that.
Yeah, I think that might be useful if that's possible. Just while you've got an opportunity, since since we are engaging, that it might be a good question to ask for future. Look, it's 3 minutes to 12. I don't see any other questions on online, but thank you to officers. That's been really, really helpful. I think we're all a bit clearer. And yes, so look, I thank you all, and having the presentations was really helpful. Just some supporting notes. So I'm assuming they'll be made available as part of the Q&A on the as part of the agenda. Yeah, so the announcement. So we know there's an announcement coming up. Just one final question around some potential policy implication, or maybe not for development contributions, but certainly for building coming out of MFE and the government today. Is that likely to impact on anything that we're doing here? Without knowing what they are until 12 o'clock?
Yeah, but I'll hand over to Baz on this one.
We can't
Okay.
comment at this point in time.
So will you give us some advice on whether, subject to any announcements today, what impact that might have on the papers in front of us on Thursday?
We will do. Yep.
Thank you. All right. Great. Thank you all. Yeah, so I think that's all. And thank you, my colleagues, for being online. And we'll see you all at the Finance and Performance meeting on